The Sound Off Podcast. The show about podcast and broadcast. Starts now.
I'm really glad I get to do this because so many times when you and I have met in the past, it was work related or business related. And I never really got to sit down to talk to you about this incredible career that you've had in radio, because I always wanted to know about the time when, and there were many times, and hopefully today I don't forget any of those times. So thanks for doing this.
For sure. Absolutely.
So your name came up, I guess, about a year ago because I had May Potts on the show. And you and May, I think, crossed paths a few times, sort of right at the beginning. And you started in radio. It was about 1979, and it was Newmarket. And how did you get there?
Well, Newmarket was part of a number of those sort of weekend part-time gigs. There was also, Guelph. Seajoy was my first full-time gig. But Newmarket a couple of times because there was CKAN when it was the AM. And then down the road, it became an FM, which was 88.5 and then, or 88.1. I can't remember. One or the other. And then, so there's a few times, and there's so many of those smaller stations that they just blur over the years. Anybody that's done radio for as long as you do kind of, they kind of blur into each other. So you tend to remember the highlights, the stations you've worked longer at. But CKN, I remember just driving. I lived in Scarborough, and we just drove up on the weekends. I remember that back then it seemed like a far drive, but not anymore. Right? It was like Burlington. We're working at Energy 108. I remember I was working at CFNY, which was in Brantford. And I remember driving out because I wanted to explore other stations, and I was looking at, what might be my next job. And in radio, you're always, if you're smart, you're thinking ahead and thinking, things can happen, and they do. Formats change and people get shuffled around. And I remember driving out to Burlington from Brampton and thinking, this is really far. Wow. This is wow. Just way too far. It just felt forever. And now it doesn't at all, of course. Everything, Toronto over the years has just exploded, so that goes for the Newmarket story and the Burlington, Hamilton, everything just, from now you go from Mississauga to Oakville to Burlington, and all of a sudden you're in Hamilton, and it just seems like one giant city now.
And how did you get into CFNY, which at the time was a Brampton station?
Yes.
And if you didn't know it, it did feel like it was not a Toronto station. It was outside and away.
Yes.
It was a suburban station.
Very much so. Yeah. So there was an AM to CFNY. Some people talk about the story or tell the story when the AM was CHIC, CHIC, and at one time that station had all females on the air, and it was around the late 70s when disco was, 77, 78, 79, when disco was really huge. And then later on they changed the call letters to CKMW for Metro West. It was still owned by the same company, and it was the AM to CFNY. And I got a job there. That's actually where I met May Potts. She was hired and did overnights. And it was the time, and so this is around 83 when the owners were splitting off the AM and FM of CFNY. But literally in the same hallway, just down the hallway was the AM, and we shared the news department, we shared the writers, we shared a number of things between the two stations. But that's when Bill Evanov came in and another partner, and they bought the AM, and that's where it split off. And eventually became a multicultural station, but because they didn't have, Bill and the other people he was working with didn't have everything lined up, he had all these hours during the day. And I think the CRTC promise was that, okay, you can become multicultural, but only so many hours a day. And so I went to Bill and I said, listen, do you mind if I program the English hours of the station? And that's where I presented him with the idea of doing this urban contemporary format, as it was called at the time. So it was a mixture of top 40 and urban music, R&B and some hip hop and some other stuff that normally was not getting played in Canada. And that was a lot of fun. It was called Radio 790, CKMW, rhythm radio, and it lasted for a few years. But eventually I managed to get a job down the hallway at CFNY, as did May Potts. So that's where we both came from, the AM of CFNY, which was Radio 790, and then started working at CFNY. So that I started 84, and I think May came over around 86, 87.
For those who are listening to this in audio format, you're not going to be able to necessarily see the joy that I'm seeing right now. And that's probably two of the greatest things going on. And that's a large collection of bottled booze. And as well, I believe, is that a CD collection behind you?
That is, yeah. So just behind me, if you're just hearing this audio, so I've got a wall of CDs. That was hard. I downsized when I moved to where I am now. I did give away, sell off a number of CDs, but I still have a few thousand on the wall here. And then you can't see to my other side, I do have a vinyl collection, but it's down to like 4 or 5 bins now. But I also have a Scotch collection. Yes, I definitely. I have my single malts and a few other. So in my little bar, this is sort of my man cave, my sound room. So I've got my stereo in here. I've got my little office set up with my computer, lots and lots of music, and Scotch.
Where did you get your ear for music?
Well, I think, and I've talked to a number of people that got into radio, that I've termed it before. It's almost like some people that failed to be musicians and failed to make it in a band or failed to make it in music. So I wanted to do music. I actually wanted to be in a band, and I was in a couple of bands. But one thing I noticed is I worked with this band and watched other players, and you played with other bands, or other bands opened for you and you opened for other bands. But I realized I wasn't great. I played a little guitar. I played a little drums. I sang not very well, but there was all of the things I did from guitar to drums to singing. It was just really mediocre. And I realized when obviously you'd go see concerts of successful bands and you realize, man, that guy plays guitar. I could never play guitar like that, and I can't sing like that. And that drummer, I could never drum like that. So it was an awakening that I don't think, foresight, looking ahead, I thought, I don't think I'll ever make it in the music business. It's a tough haul. But listening to radio, and I listened to guys on the radio, and I thought, that doesn't sound that hard. I think maybe I could do that. And so I just kind of practiced and emulated talking on the radio, and you probably do it in your car, or maybe just as you're listening to the radio at home, you practice talking in and out of records. And I thought, you know what? I think I could do this. And I thought that's a safer way to get into the music business. So if I work at a radio station, I get to play music. I'm close to music. Maybe I'll interview some artists. So that was kind of the path and choice. I thought, still my parents thought it was crazy. I thought, that's not a job. My dad wanted me to, be an electrician, do a trade, an electrician or plumber, whatever. So that kind of freaked them out a little bit that I was going to get into radio. But that was the way in. I just thought, I don't think I could be in a band. Let's try radio.
Could it have easily been working A&R at a record company?
Yes. Probably it's something I should have looked at and never did, because I guess radio became so much fun. And one of the things about radio that I discovered soon as I got into the business is I realized not all music was being played on the radio. And that's one of the things that I did in my career. And, CFNY is a great example of, I really admired radio stations or stations that would take chances on music, breaking new music. That became, a big thing for me from my days at CFNY and Energy 108. That's one of the reasons I did Energy 108 is I thought, and that answers your question about, I could work in the for a record company. Maybe I could go down that path, which did interest me. But I thought we still have this problem of songs not being played on the radio, and too much of a problem that I thought I'm going to stay in radio and I'm going to see what I can do. That's going to be one of my, my goals is to see if I can help break music on the radio, introduce music on the radio that, your typical radio station doesn't play. And I think, over the years, I managed to be a part of that and have done a job like that for the stations I worked at.
How did you know what to bring to 790 when you got the opportunity from Bill Evanov? How did you know the format or what the mix of music was going to be?
It was a number of things, a combination of things. I had done in my years at CFNY. There was a time when CFNY was, we call it the mistake of '88, when the station was experimenting, playing top 40 with alternative music. And when that was happening, I saw, the writing on the wall that the station may not be the same CFNY that it was. So I started doing some research, and one of the things I did, and I actually took a sabbatical for a couple of months, and I just literally got in the car. I drove down to Florida was my final destination because my parents had a condo there, so I could stay there. But on my way, I visited and I called ahead. I called a number of really big black radio stations. I went to V103 in Atlanta. I went to a station in Washington. I went to another station in Philadelphia, some of the big black stations. And I had appointments with the PDs, and I went to talk to them about, the music, the format, because this hasn't been done in Canada. And we had a lot of people in the GTA, Southern Ontario, listen to BLK out of Buffalo. And I thought, wow, I'd love to be part of a station in Canada that broke some of this music, that played some of this music that nobody else was playing. And there are a few, there's College Station, of course. Some college stations were helping, and even CFNY was playing some music that in the genre that many stations weren't playing. But anyway, that's where I got the taste for it. Always wanted to do that, and that's where, Radio 790 was my first taste of that in 83, 84, where Bill Evanov said, sure, go ahead. And to everyone's surprise, and Bill, certainly, the station was actually quite successful. And we did this breakdance contest in the summer of, I guess it was June, maybe it was June or July of 84 in Brampton, Chinguacousy Park, Brampton. And we thought about 600 or 700 people would show up, and ended up being like 6,000 people. And this is when breakdancing was a big thing, and there were a couple of movies that came out that year, and it was hugely successful. Eventually Bill continued on with the station as being a multicultural station, so that faded away. But that always stayed with me. And later on, the opportunity came up where I met Bill again. And we talked about Energy 108 and did that 92, through most of the 90s. And that was similar, again, exposing, some of that black music, but also things had changed in the 90s. There was other forms of dance music and rhythmic music that needed exposure, and gave us a great opportunity to fill that and run with that on Energy 108. It was an awesome time.
So what did you bring to CFNY in 1984-ish? Because there's still, again, a lot of music is not making it to the radio. So what kind of music did you manage to get on CFNY?
Well, it's interesting that even from down the hall when I was at Radio 790, myself and May Potts, and we were friends with a lot of people at CFNY, we would go down the hallway with some, imports that we had come across. And interesting that Bill Evanov had some great connections with the Italian community. And we used to get these imports, people from Italy, he had a couple of connections he had, would actually send us the latest singles in Italy. And there was just a myriad of stuff that was being played in Europe and out of Italy. And there was a few records I took down to CFNY that they didn't have, that I said, well, I got this import from Italy. And I think, Fiction Factory, Feels Like Heaven was one song, and others. And, of course, CFNY played a lot of imports. So that was one of the influences that I had in. And then we had from both Radio 790 and CFNY had their connections for import records. And there were places like a place called like Mellow Music on Kennedy Road in Scarborough. The guy that ran that literally every week drove to Detroit, sometimes Buffalo, but he would, for whatever reason, Detroit had a better stock of records, but he would literally drive to Detroit every week and get the latest records out of the U.S. And of course, a lot of, black records, R&B, funk, and hip hop. The record companies in Canada weren't even touching them because there wasn't the market. There weren't the radio stations to play it. So there's a number of records that never got the release, or it took a while to get the release. So there was this channel of, and that's my experience with CFNY. I learned the need in Canada, sadly, to look at imported records for the hits, and that's what we did, at Energy 108 when there was a rule of hit and non-hit. One of the ways around that was, well, okay, I can only play 50% or 49% or whatever it was of hits. But I thought, wow, there's all these import records that are hit records that are very accessible, very, commercial sounding. But they're out in Italy and they're out in England and they're out in France and they're out in Germany and they're not released here yet, but boy, they ever catchy. Let's just start playing those, and that's, where a lot of the Euro sound and Ace of Base and Rhythm as a Dancer and all of those records that came out of Europe, we played on Energy before they were hits. So we got the non-hits because this is at a time, and you remember early 90s. I don't know when they lifted the hit non-hit rule, but
91.
Yeah, okay. But that was a challenge for FM radio in those certain years. They couldn't really do top 40 on FM radio for a time.
Just to give people an idea about how important it was to maintain all those regulations, some radio stations had a position of director of foreground programming, which is one title that you had when you were at CFNY. Yes.
So it was complicated. Yeah, director of foreground and mosaic programming. We had all these different rules that the CRTC had put in place to keep FM radio different from AM radio. And it was also to extend the health of AM radio as people were starting to like FM because it just sounded better. The CRTC did, and I guess a lot of the radio stations wanted that, a little bit of help, because FM was, we knew the writing again was on the wall. FM's going to take over. So they stuck these rules to make FM a little bit different. And I actually thought many of the rules were very good and made sense because it did keep FM quite interesting. But it was tricky because you had these foreground programs where if it was an hour or 2 hours, the way you passed the rules is you couldn't give a time check. You couldn't give the weather, these surveillance things, right? And
traffic.
Yeah. So,
and you had to keep it within a 15-minute block. So if you went 14 minutes and 59 seconds and then gave the temperature, you pretty much annihilated the previous 14 minutes and 59 seconds from having counted for anything of value and worth. And there were a lot of shows on the air. I know over at Q107 there was Rock Report, that would count. Sunday Music Magazine.
Yes.
That one you did?
Yes.
Yeah, there were things like that. It could be 15 minutes, it could be an hour, but you had to have X amount. And I think the other one that people forget, and this was done to protect AM top 40s, and that's that on FM you could not play a song more than 18 times in a week.
Correct. Yes.
Doesn't that sound crazy by today's standards? Considering you probably clocked in some songs over 100 times a week at the beat.
Yeah. Well, and I think even along that same thought line, the CFNY for a while did this Catch Us If You Can contest, which was hugely popular. So it was, we're only going to play, there's no song we're going to play more than once a day. And if you catch us playing a song twice, you're going to win $1,000 or whatever it was. Fantastic contest. People loved it, except I did the evening show for a number of years on CFNY. So guess what happens? So the morning, because this is an era where we were the DJs that picked our music. We got to pick the music on the station. And so all the current records, and they were on the floor, and they were records on the floor. So the morning show was like, where there's the hottest new, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, or there's the New Order, Depeche Mode. Oh, that either got played in the morning. If it didn't get played by the morning, JR would play it in the midday, or James Scott would play it by the afternoon. And by the time the evening came, I got all the shit, all the kind of, secondary records, or the ones that were, just not the biggest hits. That was fun.
Why isn't dance music as well received in North America as it was in Europe, in the 80s especially?
I don't know if I have the exact answer. It's interesting because there's a BBC documentary on disco that's on PBS right now that I'm watching. I'm on the second part of it. And they haven't got to that part yet when there was the big backlash in the U.S. But I think there's some reasons behind. I think there was the religious reasons. See, a lot of dance music came out of the gay clubs. Disco really started in the gay clubs. And those clubs were very open-minded and had some of the greatest parties. And it wasn't just gay people, but a lot of straight people or people that were, marginalized or were a little bit different. But that's kind of the roots of where it came from. And I think there was a certain point that the whole disco sucks thing really resonated with a number of people in the U.S. And I think, there's a certain religious context to that anti-gay part of it that helped spur that it, dance music was, very gay friendly. And in the U.S., once that gets hold, it can really grow. And I think that's really where it came from. And then if there were some people in Canada that also jumped on that bandwagon without really understanding the music. And I think that's another thing when disco at one point, was absolutely massive, both on the radio, but in the clubs there were, and I remember, late 70s, certainly in Ontario and around the Toronto area, there was not a restaurant that didn't have a dance floor that, on their Thursday and Friday and Saturday nights were playing disco that they normally wouldn't do. And it killed the other part of it. Disco almost became too big, that it killed a lot of live bands, venues that were, always had live bands were having disco nights. And so I think that was part of the backlash about the people that enjoyed their live music. And then there are really staunch rock and rollers out there that were very prejudiced against, dance music and its various forms. So it had a tough time in North America. And as you pointed out, in Europe, they didn't have the backlash in Europe. And it was a very North American thing, mostly American thing, but Canada kind of followed suit to a degree, but not to the same extent.
Today, I see something that has happened as a result of that, which, this is not very monumental stuff. But when you go backwards and you want to talk about the throwbacks, and let's say you had a throwback radio station right now, and if you reached into the era 1980, 81, just to the early part of 1982, it is a complete wasteland of throwback records. Because if you look at the top 40 charts, it is all slow, it is all dull, it's not very interesting. There's very, very few songs to really choose from that have any pop. And if you do, I think there's Blondie. There was stuff, and that came out of the clubs. That came from the streets. So there really wasn't a lot of great music that was on the radio at that point. And I know this is a theme that I've touched on a number of times on the show, and that, when you get to 1982 and MTV has had 6 months, and it was Duran Duran and everything that came over from Europe that began to populate the airwaves, that there was a resurgence, and then the tempo did come back to the radio. And then this is around the same time, by the way, that you started to bring some dance music to the radio. But I sort of feel that, did disco get rebranded as dance?
Absolutely. And I think over the years, generationally, that people like to stamp it their own. And so names will change, from, that global term of dance music. And dance music in, the early 90s, when we started Energy 108, dance music meant house music, it meant R&B, it meant hip hop, it meant techno, Euro, freestyle, electro, all the different genres were under that dance music. But there was a certain point where that term became a little bit dated, and then the term electronica came in, and then electronic was a sort of blanket term, which still is used today, a blanket term for all music that's generally dance oriented, EDM, electronic dance music. It's really the same thing, but we're just finding new terms, new things to call them over the years, and that's natural.
I feel as though I missed the entire Energy 108 era in Toronto, largely because I didn't live in Toronto. I could only hear tell of the stories that had gone on. So what made this station so great?
Well, I think, part of the theme of what you've brought up is, dance music. One of the things I ran into with dance music, and maybe this is because there's been this prejudice on the radio, and I ran into it, and people would actually say that, to me, to my face, you can't play dance music on the radio. Dance music doesn't belong on the radio. Dance music's for the clubs. And I get that to a degree, but I was out to prove that wrong. And we certainly saw that with disco, because disco came out of the clubs and got onto the radio, and some of the biggest hits, from Donna Summer to the Bee Gees, et cetera, got played on the radio and were radio songs. So the argument doesn't work. And so fast forward, we had this disco backlash, and disco died, and there's, as you got later into the 80s, house music started to rise. And house music is, it's disco music. It depends what you want to call it. It's dance music. So they came up with this new term, house music. And that became very popular. And I saw that happening. And I saw techno, late 80s. Techno was starting to happen. The rave scene was starting to happen. All these really cool things were happening. And of course, we had a lot of urban music out of the U.S. that was not getting played on the radio in Canada. And all of that just was like, oh my God, here we are again. This stuff can work on the radio. There's a lot of great music. Yes, there's some of it maybe is better for the club. I agree. Then we came up with these live to airs, and here became this. Wait a minute! So we could take a broadcast and take a feed from a club and play it on the radio. So it's Friday and Saturday night. People are in different moods, so their taste of what they want to hear is different on weekends. It's different in the evenings than daytime. And a lot of programmers just didn't recognize that. And so,
and after midnight, no regs.
Yeah. And, and Chris Shepard helped prove, everybody that you could do a show from a club. He played whatever he wanted. And they were number one, he was number one rated radio show, when he was on CFNY and when he was on Energy. His ratings were just enormous. So you can do it. But it's, I think people that are just stuck in the old ways and are just as scared to try new things, right? That's typical.
Well, I was going to suggest you need a radio station to play the music to get you to the club, but then you already brought up the point that, you can play the music in the club and send it back out through the radio. I remember in Montreal, I don't know if we picked up the idea or it had evolved as well, but it was $1.5 million a year in revenue. How much money did you see at one point?
Yeah, we charged when the club scene was exploding. This is early '90s, mid '90s, late '80s, early '90s, mid '90s, especially with Energy 108. We were charging $5,000 for a live to air, and then the DJ got paid on top of that. And then myself as a DJ and others, we were making $500 to $1,000 cash a night at a club. Plus, they were paying the $5,000 to the radio station for the live to air. It was incredible. And we had live to airs on the radio Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights for many years. Incredible. And we trusted the host. We trusted the DJs. We had meetings with the DJs, but we made sure your club, the music. You run the show, and it worked. It's funny because I would have calls from other radio stations across the country that would call up, and they'd ask about these live to airs. Like, I hear you're doing these Energy 108 live to airs, and they're great for revenue and great money makers. And the part that really freaked everybody out was, excuse me, you don't have a playlist? You don't give them a playlist to what to play from the club? I go, no. The DJ at the club plays it. No. We trust the DJs. We know the DJs. They're like, oh, no, we can't do that. And I said, so that was a big sticking point for a lot of, they couldn't give away that control. They really wanted to control the music. So that was a tough one.
It was a tough time sort of in the early 90s, to get an urban record on. So I know, because there were times I would listen to the song and go, that's a hit. I like to play that.
Yes. But
it's top 40. And it might be on Billboard in the 30s, but it's just not quite ready for Canada. So how come and I don't even think today we've done it, how come we can't overcome this where, an urban format radio station really resides in this country?
Yeah. It's a strange, odd thing I don't know if I know the answer to. And we certainly know there was a sort of no rap thing for a lot of programmers. One argument, and I don't know if that's the answer, I used to say, well, it's because a lot of programmers in Canada are white guys that grew up on rock music, and they don't understand rap, hip hop, and that music. And I don't know if that's fair, but that may be one answer to it. The other being, Canada's not the U.S. Yes, there is a truth of the population. Certainly, like, a city like Atlanta is, 70, 80%, Black or African American. And so there's a multicultural advantage that Toronto has, though I think we can do that in Toronto, but you may not be able to do it in other Canadian cities. So the ethnic makeup is one of the questions that maybe is one of the challenges. But the other funny side to things is, we all know this from record sales, is that a lot of rap music and hip hop music sold millions of records to white people. So I don't know where it originally came from. This, you can't you can't play a rap on the radio. And there was always, and they came out with versions of songs they were without the rap, the no rap version, and that would get played. And it was just like, really? I get that maybe for an AC station, a softer station, but I think for top 40, it makes no sense whatsoever to me that why you couldn't play the rap song and a rap song at 6 a.m. The day partying. And I've always been anti-day partying. I think it's all nonsense. But there's been a lot of that in radio. And the no 2 or 3 female vocals in a row nonsense. Like, but don't understand it.
Somebody had a quote at the radio conference at Canadian Music Week just last week, and was about the definition of a program director. It's like always creating these rules and work in order to sort of justify the position of program director, right? So if you can come up with these rules, you can keep your job.
There's some truth in that, I think. I think there's some truth in that. Yeah, rules are meant to be broken, and many of them have been broken over the years. That maybe at some time it made some sense to play. I don't know. Someone could explain that to me, why you couldn't play more than 2 females in a row or whatever the rule was. I don't know. That is just bizarre.
I think the justification was that they wanted to present, because radio was the only game in town,
right?
Was to present a form of diversity amongst the artists. So the same rules would apply to corporate rock. The same rules would apply. You don't want to play Springsteen next to Bon Jovi. You don't want to play Boston next to Foreigner. You don't want to play next to, and eventually, we don't want to play 2 women. We also don't want to play, 2 artists from the same region, from the same town, that sound the same. No 2 dance records together. So these were all a collection of rules to justify the position of program director, so some people would stay employed.
Yes. Well, blending is, I think, really key, and I think some of those. For those that don't know, we have these fantastic software systems like Music Master, and there's so many little things you can do with it. And there are some pretty cool little rules you can put in there to make the mix and the blend more interesting. That's true. I don't disagree on that, but I'm not sure there was ever a no 2 males in a row. So if you're going to have, you can't play 2 or 3 females in a row, because you want to mix it up so there's a male vocalist and then there's a female vocalist. But I honestly don't ever remember anybody ever saying, oh, you can't play 2 guys in a row. Why is that? Or maybe there was.
I might have had a rule that said we don't want to have 2 from the same genre. So
yeah.
I didn't, I put a rule in so that Mellencamp and Springsteen couldn't be back to back.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes, you could get into the minutiae of this stuff, and it can get quite silly, but there is some.
It's incredibly silly. Day parting was silly.
Yeah.
These rules I'm talking about now, which we did, were silly. These music systems are actually based on the premise of saying no. And I think RCS Selector at one point said, let's create a system where it's yes, give me more of this and give me more of this.
Yeah.
Which had to change the thinking of a lot of people who did programming. But to think that your radio station is going to sync based on playing 2 females back to back, or a song that should be allegedly day parted to a certain hour, is a little nuts.
Yeah, I think at one time, one of the simplest things I came up with, because you got into these sort of subgenres of styles, and then I just decided at one point I'm going to, and I guess it was for a kind of classic hits format. I just said it's either a pop song or a rock song. I'm going to have the 2 categories, and we're going to make sure that it blends. We don't have, if there's 2 pops in a row. If we were rock leaning, it would be okay. You can't have more than 2 pops in a row. If it was a little softer leaning, we could have several pops in a row, and that really worked really, really well. It just said, you know what, this is and you went song by song, not by the artist. You went song by song, and this is a pop song, this is a rock song, and it's a beautiful blend.
What did you see when you did some auditorium testing and you took dance records into an auditorium test, and maybe in the 90s they played next to Third Eye Blind, Jumper, or Semi-Charmed Life, or maybe they, sat next to Oasis, Wonderwall, some of the more typical 90s songs we hear. How did some of those big dance songs do in an auditorium test?
Well, Fortunately, and I would look at this as a positive thing, that in the energy years, we never had a budget to do music testing. And, we had the beauty of being in the clubs. We all DJ'd in the clubs. We were in the clubs. You could see the reaction of tracks. And we just went by gut and feel and listen. And there were really no charts to follow because we were doing our own thing. And I do remember once that, when Shaw was coming in to purchase the station that became Corus. And I remember, I forget who it was, but he came in to kind of look at what we're doing. And he says, let me see your R&R. And I think we had a subscription to it, but they literally just collected dust in the corner. And I'm like, oh shit, I got to find the R&R in the billboard. We really never looked at them. But later on, so when Shaw came in and purchased Energy 108, there was some money to do a couple of tests. It wasn't an auditorium test, I don't think. But I remember the test coming back, and there was some of that, Third Eye Blind mixed with the dance records. But I do remember the number one testing record that came back, and it may have been because we had already branded ourselves as this dance mix. But Ghetto Superstar by Praz was like the number one, like just tested through the roof. And we just laughed at that because I think they were expecting other stuff from Matchbox 20 and other to do all that were going to test well, as they were trying to, mix up the format at the time. But, that's a lesson in branding. The station had been branded so long as Energy 108 that when they started to introduce Matchbox 20, and these are big hits, the audience just freaked out. I mean, you could go for hours and not hear a guitar on the station, and then when you heard, the first couple of songs that had a bit of guitar, bass, guitar, drums, it was like, ah!
Were there any CanCon challenges?
Yes, a lot. Yeah, I mean, this is the 90s. This is before Drake. This is before, hip hop in Toronto and The Weeknd and other artists. And just the quality of productions did not really come in until, into the 2000s. So it was just a real struggle to find the CanCon. And of course, the mid 90s, Jagged Little Pill came out, Alanis Morissette. And I'm like, oh, geez, I can't play this. This is the biggest record in the world and it's CanCon and I can't play it. And there were other, obviously, Canada's done rock and pop rock really, really well. And we just, we couldn't go there. We played some remixes. There were a few things that we got the record company to do a remix of. So we managed to, make it through, but we did play some definite mediocre tracks. We had to.
Did you ever explore the Quebec model of what they did, which was to take Canadian songs, mix it into Super Dance Mix, and then play it on the radio and count it as a CanCon? Did you ever get into that sort of gamesmanship?
Oh, we did the mixes. We did the what was the term? We actually had there was a term for it. It was montage or something. It was the montage rule. So we for our live to airs. So it was the beginning of it. So when you hit a stop set, that was the end of the montage. So if we started at, say, the live to air started at 10 o'clock and we ran, because I think we only ran one stop set an hour because it was just hard to break up the music. That wouldn't happen in the club, of course. You break away and you play a stop set on the radio, but not in the club. But it was but on the radio, as soon as you stop the mix of music, that's one montage. So that counted as one song. And so brilliantly, you could, play, if it's a half-hour sweep, good Lord, it could be 12 songs in a mix, and it would count as one song. I think they killed that montage rule years ago. But,
oh, yeah. No,
but it was great.
And then they went up to CanCon, I think, probably in the same movement.
Yeah, so I think in order for it to, if that one song to count as CanCon, like 50% of the mix of songs had to be Canadian or something like that. It was ridiculous. But it really, really helped us, because to do what we were doing as a format, we needed that montage rule. And I think that we may have talked to the CRTC in developing that rule, which really, really helped us enable to do these live to airs and mix shows. So, we did a mix show at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour-long mix show. Like some of these DJs, the ones that cut out of songs really fast, at the end of the hour, you played 50 songs. Imagine trying to do that with the normal CanCon rules, right? So the CRTC were very good in understanding what we were trying to do. And then, of course, at some point, people started to abusing that, which, yes, you're right. I think there was a few Quebec situations when they got out of control.
So we're in 2024. I believe I can count the number of urban radio stations in Canada on one finger, if any.
Yeah.
It's disgraceful. I think
it's bizarre.
Canadian radio is the whitest thing ever across the country. If I go to Atlanta, I'm going to listen to Music Power V103. If I go to New York, I want to listen to WBLS. I know the stations. These are the stations that everybody listens to. Yet for whatever reason, we can't seem to cull together, a format or a radio station in order to properly reflect this brand of music. And so, it was, I think, early 90s. I may have been the 2000s. I've now got my decades mixed up. But, Flow comes on the radio.
Yeah.
And how would you grade that? How would you grade Flow?
Yeah, and I think probably early 2000s for Flow. And just to go back on your point is that I think one of the things that has happened with the power and strength of hip hop, the hip hop became so huge that it blended into so many different music styles. So there's a lot of pop songs, that are played on Canadian radio that are so hip hop influenced. And, hip hop songs being played on, top 40 stations in Canada. So it's come a long way, and having, just rap being played on Canadian radio is much, much better these days than it was, back in the 90s. So it definitely got better, but it's still puzzling how a station like Flow didn't become bigger. It did okay. It did well. But it just wasn't up there with a CHFI in Toronto and a Chum FM and
Top 5.
Like how did it not get that there? I don't know. I know in the early days, there was a lot of arguments because Toronto's got this Caribbean contingency. There's a lot of Jamaicans in Toronto. So there's a lot of people from the islands. So there's the different blend of, urban music or black music. And I think there was some arguments about, we should be playing more soca. We should be playing calypso. We should be playing reggae. And then other people wanted more traditional urban black station that played, hip hop and R&B, just hip hop and R&B. So I think there was some arguing, infighting in those days. And I would argue in Canada, you could play more reggae. And that's another funny thing about the urban stations that I discovered in the US is that they don't play, there's really rare you'll ever hear reggae, where you could probably and should play that in Canada. And maybe I'm speaking of, Toronto because of the Caribbean community that Toronto's had over the years. And an openness for Caribbean music and reggae and things like that. But that's a funny thing about, if you go down to some of these U.S. stations in these big cities, outside of Bob Marley, they rarely play reggae. So that's a funny thing. But yeah, going back to why there weren't, the stations, even though there was a time there was one in Calgary and there was the Beat in Vancouver, the early stages of the Beat was very urban, and Beat Kitchener was very urban flavored when it started. But they never got the ratings, which was very puzzling. I don't know the answer to that. we certainly can argue it today is that the streaming is a big factor, and that the radio isn't where young people are going to get all their new, particularly new music these days, right? It's challenged that way for sure.
And the Beat Vancouver was somewhere that you went to program.
Yes.
In 2003. So all these years in Toronto, and now you're moving to Vancouver.
Yes. So that was, it was a independent that got the license. When I went out there, it was just poorly programmed. And my, knowing Vancouver, I spent some time before I started at the station researching, went around, talked to people, went to the clubs, went around. And one of the things I discovered is I thought, okay, there's an appetite for urban music, but there's an appetite for dance music. And I think the station should be more rhythmic, so a blend. And that's what I introduced, that we can play some of the hip hop and R&B, but we're going to blend them with some more traditional pop dance music. And we did a blend of that, and it worked really, really well. It was very successful for a while. And then it eventually went top 40 as all these stations we talked about. Eventually, at some point, the business side of it comes in and going, hey, the ratings aren't big enough. We're not making enough money. Where's the money? Let's go top 40. Or in some cases, there's a little bit of a rhythmic feel. And you could argue that in the music over the years, depending on what's available to play on top 40, it goes through these cycles, right? And it can be quite rhythmic in nature, depending on what's coming out. But I think that happened to a lot of those stations. They did eventually just become full service top 40s.
I don't recall the cycle in 2003, 2004, but I do remember working at Standard Radio. And when we took out numbers for Vancouver, we would see the beat start to really incrementally move in on 95.3, which was the traditional, Z95.3 was the traditional top 40 radio station. Went through some problems and changes, rebranded as Crave. I'm sure you were there to maybe see some of that stuff, some of that wobbliness that they went through. But you essentially brought the beat to number one at that point.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was doing extremely well. I used some of the things I learned from Energy and, having mix shows on the radio that did really well. And that, again, a lot of traditional programmers were like, you can't have a mix show at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's for the clubs, and I think,
Scott doesn't do day parts.
yeah. And Z103 today is a great example of a station that over the years, kept a little bit of the DNA of Energy 108 in doing what they were doing and have always been a station that's championed, dance music. And their mix shows are with PPM came along and PPM Don't Lie, the mix shows were, and still to this day, are their highest rated shows on the station. So they do very, very well. But yeah, we had a great time with the beat in Vancouver, and just a blast. It was a real great success.
Did you leave the beat because it got sold?
No, I got fired. It was one of the, in the radio business, you get fired every now and then or restructured.
Good job.
Yeah. So I don't know what happened. It's a long story, but yeah. I was out, and I think they wanted to go in a top 40 direction, and I was being pretty adamant about keeping it rhythmic. Anyway, it just didn't work out. But I had fun.
Back to Toronto you went.
Yes. So I think when I came back, it was for a short time. Pat Cardinal gave me a chance because I was between jobs, working for the short-lived time there was a Jack in Toronto. So I did afternoon drive on Jack for a very short time because they were struggling with the Jack in Toronto. And I was there for the short time where Pat came in my office and said, "Oh, I hate to do this, man. I got to fire you." He says, "But don't tell everybody else. You're the first. I got to fire all the announcers." I go, "What?" He goes, Yeah. We're going to go jock free. We're going to try no jocks, just music. And I'm like, okay. So I don't feel so bad. It's not just me. So I was that was a short gig, and that's when Ross Winters, when he was with Corus, gave me a call and said we needed somebody out in Kitchener, and that's when I started my run in Kitchener with first Dave FM that became Dave Rocks, and then Corus purchased the Beat Kitchener, which when I came in was very very urban but really poorly programmed. Cleaned that one up and kept it rhythmic leaning, top 40 rhythmic.
So you said poorly programmed twice. So, but what are you seeing? Are you seeing bad clocks? Are you seeing bad record selection? Are you seeing bad jocks?
Mostly the first two.
Okay.
To me, that's the key is the music choice, the clocks, the music blend, the choice of music, absolutely. And how different programs are put together. Then definitely the talent. So it was a mishmash of a few loose pieces here and there. And when I went to the Beat, Mocha was doing Afternoon Drive, and I was listening to everybody and looking at everybody, and I thought, gee, this is the most talented guy on the radio station, and he's doing Drive. And I said to Mocha, I said, look, have you ever thought of doing mornings? And he was like, oh. But he thought about it, and then he said, okay, under one condition, I'll do mornings for you. I said, okay, what's that? He says that I still do the music, that I'm still the music director. And I said, it's a lot of work doing a morning show and doing the music and that, but yeah, okay. And he stayed on doing that. And it wasn't that he was picking bad music. It was just that they were just running amok in terms of we can play anything. So it needed some structure. And there were some just deep tracks and some pretty rough CanCon they were playing, that sort of thing. So it's just cleaning it up, right? And pretty obvious. It's just from listening, it's like, okay, this is easy, because it was just so many things that I thought at least were easy to fix. And that's the first thing when I ever jumped in at a radio station is I just listened to it and I'd go, oh yeah, it'd be like I can make this sound, I can make this pop, I can make this sound better. But there's been a couple other times I'm like, no, this is pretty good. I'm not sure why they need me. So.
Yeah, it's tough to explain because I've listened to a few stations recently and, with other radio people, and we talk about it being sort of, this is a nice listen and this is not a nice listen. And, do elements transition well from one thing to another? Do things come out of nowhere? Is this too loud? Is this too abrupt? Is this, it's got to have a feel, and everything's got to have, it's all got to kind of mesh in a particular way. It's like you can't explain why this works. You just know sonically it does work. And that's really, I know I was making fun of program directors earlier, but as a recovering program director, you know it when you hear it.
Absolutely. Yeah, fair enough. And I think the other part of that is, for me, was imaging. The music, number one, the clocks, how the music's presented, but imaging to me has always been at the forefront of what I've done. Really, really strong imaging, clever imaging. For those that don't know it, it's the stuff between the songs that are not the announcers, the IDs, and just having special type of ID, whether it's a jingle or it's just really having a great producer. That was really, really key. Really strong producers. I've been so lucky to work with some of the best producers in the business that do great, tight production. And even, working with a really good jingle package too, to make it all just pop and tight, and that top 40 radio should be. That's got to be that's such a key part of it. And then having the announcers that get it, giving them some freedom, and playing tracks first that other people wouldn't take a chance on, to make the radio station super exciting. Wow, did you hear that song? Having those really key tracks that you're first on, Super exciting, in radio. That's always been a thrill for me, just being on a hot track before other people and playing, and not being afraid to play it in heavy. And very few stations are playing it, and we just added it, and we're playing it in heavy rotation.
Give me your favorite record that you added first that you're most proud of.
Ace of Base comes to mind, in the top 40 realm, that we played Ace of Base before anybody else, and a whole number of those Euro records, those pop records out of Europe, from Saturday Night Wakefield to so many others that we played first. And the listener reaction and just seeing it in the clubs, that was a absolute thrill. And in CFNY, the years that we broke so many tracks, bands, playing stuff before anybody else, was again just a thrill from the Depeche Modes and the New Orders and the Smiths. Being able to play a band like the Smiths that very few stations would touch, and just one of the greatest bands of the 80s.
Favorite imaging voice for a dance station?
It just pops in mind. Rest in peace, Bumper Morgan. And I remember I was telling you the story when I was on that trip down through the U.S. to listen to some U.S. stations, some black stations in some of the key markets. And when I got down to Florida, the big station down there was the Power Pig.
93.3, the Power Pig.
That's it. And this is like they had flipped, I think it was 90, 89, 90, 91. I can't remember when they flipped to the Power Pig. And those that don't know the story, just Google it. It's a fantastic radio story. One of my favorite things was they, instead of having expensive promo vehicles, they bought a whole bunch of vehicles from wrecking yards and spray painted them all pink and just spray painted Power Pig on the side of them. And I think they had about 9 or 10 of these vehicles, just drove them around town. They stood out. They just looked awful, and they stood out. And they took over. I think it was one of the fastest from bottom to the top when they took over that market. Absolutely fantastic. And then the imaging, this guy, Bumper Morgan was his name. And just super in your face, very loud, very American sounding production that, and I heard that voice. I said, okay, I need something for energy that's just going to just cut through everything that you hear in polite Ontario, Canada, Toronto. And so, yeah, we had some fun with that. And, everything from, is that the CN tower in your pocket, or you're just happy to hear us? Energy 108. Sorry, just stupid stuff. Well, it was it was a lot of fun, and just over the top compression production was a lot of fun.
For those who want to just scroll backwards when you're done this episode, there's an episode with Jason Dixon from last summer, who was on the promo team at the Power Pig and talks about its early days extensively.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a pretty cool time. And there's just been so many other voices. Some of the names just are not on the top of my head right now, but just some of the voices and that I've worked with, imaging voices from various stations that I've loved over the years. And again, my producers, from Jay Tufford, Johnny Q, all the different producers I've worked with over the years have just been fantastic.
And producers are important. I know that I've walked into some stations and listened to some imaging from some producers, and I said, we're going to need another producer.
Yeah. Wado is another guy who still works for Bell Media Toronto. I think he does the stuff for Virgin and Chum. Wade Taylor, Wado, we call him. A whole bunch of people that came out of Energy 108. Two guys that actually work out of the U.S. now. One guy, his name escapes me right now, but he's he works out of the U.S., but he's the voice for CP24. And a few other people. And that's been a thrill in this business, that I've got to say, that to see people that I've worked with, that work for me, go on to have these amazing careers and be super successful, many that are still working in radio today.
Is that Mike Gorel?
Mike Gorel, thank you. Mike Gorel, yeah. Mike
and you
Gorel.
Can scroll back in this stack as well and listen to my podcast episode I did with him.
Oh, great, yes. Oh, Mike, fantastic. And these guys all had great ears and just had a knack, and they all had a style, and they all loved to have fun and all loved music. It was, that's a great point. Really good production people, really good producers they can make the sound of a station so vital, so vital.
Tell me about your time at Corus, because we've gotten this far. You've worked for independents. You've worked for a lot of independent people, and now here you are, you're working with Corus, which is really sort of a big corporate conglomeration. Mm-hmm. Now you got multiple radio stations. You've got 107.5 Dave, and just if everyone's scoring at home, it was Bob FM that started in Winnipeg, which rolled out across America. Then it was Jack for Rogers, and then Corus comes up with Dave, and Dave is actually quite a successful brand.
Yeah.
As it were. So tell me what it was like to work inside of Corus, which was a corporate company that had Nelvana, and it had television and cable, and here we are doing radio.
Yeah, I think in those years, because originally there was Shaw, and they were forced to spin off Corus for the radio division. I think that actually helped, because there was a definite focus on radio and to be a great radio company. And I think those early years, I still very fondly look back at the years with Corus. I learned a lot, worked with so many people. Yeah, and I think their management culture, they did a lot of training. They did, seminars. They talk about providing all the tools you need, the support system, the network of how everybody worked together, and you could call other PDs for stuff. The sharing of that works for you there, sharing a promo that worked in another market. The company was very good at doing that. And I think, and this is obviously a time where the budgets were much better. And so companies, had budgets to do these yearly, seminars where they just got everybody, all the PDs together and put them in a hotel for a couple of days, and you talked ideas, and you got training, and there were speakers and all these different things they gave you to help you do your job. I couldn't say enough about a Corus that way. So I think they had a really good radio culture, really good vision on where they wanted to grow, and we were able to do a lot with that. And he gave us all the research. And, I'm a love-hate relationship with research. Part of me, like back in the energy days, didn't give a shit about it, didn't need to. But when you have that tool, it's great to see when you're right and wrong. It's great to see a song test, and you're always thinking, this is a great song. Let's see how it tests. And then you see it and going, oh, okay, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought. So having the access to research, which is very, very expensive for those that know or don't know, it's not cheap. And so that was a great, valuable thing to have, especially when we did Dave Rocks or Dave FM. My background had done so much with top 40 and dance music with Energy 108. And before that was alternative music, but just more straight, middle of the road rock. As much as I grew up on a lot of it, wasn't really my forte. So having some of that, audience research and that stuff really, really helped, build that radio station. And one of the things we learned, and interesting from Winnipeg, one of the teams that came in and saw the music tests, and this is, we're talking, Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo, and they said, I don't know how many songs we tested, maybe 900,000 songs. But they said, comparatively, they said, this is a lot like Winnipeg. This market looks a lot like Winnipeg. And then their thirst and love of, straight ahead rock with AC/DC, and that sort of, and that was a real eye opener. And we had people in the building. That was another funny thing, because they were like, "Oh, we're playing too much Bryan Adams," and oh, do we have to play Nickelback, right? And then I remember the music tests, and every time a Nickelback song came on, it went through the roof. When they had the old dial system, and you could see you could see it on the screen, and I'm like, holy shit. And it's like, I had to go back to all the announcers going, Nickelback, yes, we're going to play Nickelback, and we're going to play a lot of Nickelback, because the audience loves Nickelback. Sorry.
And you're right. It was an excellent leadership team at Corus who gave us all the resources. And, there were a few times when, you and I would get together at Alan Cross, I think Dunner, a number of other, we'd all get together and we would just swap ideas, and you show up with your ideas and pass them around the table. And I'd have phone calls from people like, tell me about this guy's garage marketing that you're doing, and how do you do it on zero budget? Because for 7 years I had no budget in Winnipeg, yet we had successful marketing. And, I would call you up. I'd call anybody. I'd sometimes just call you up and say, hey, what's new? What are we doing? How are things going? But to your point, Metallica had the top 6 of the top 10 songs in the test, every year. And I think we also use the same research people. I think it was P1 Research with Ken Benson.
Yes, exactly. Ken and that. Yeah. That's what he said. He said, wow, this just looks like Winnipeg. And, and the AC/DC did fantastic. And we went deep, on AC/DC tracks and other tracks. And it was a lot of fun and eye-opening, and just getting to understand how they wanted their rock. And it was Ken and that team that came in and said, the rock is testing. This is when we were, Jack Bob format, the classic hits, and the pop wasn't testing as nearly as good as the rock tracks. And it was just like, why don't you just get rid of the pop stuff and just...
Dave was a rock station,
right? Yeah. And so when we first started, it was a blend of the pop and the rock. As the Jack format, it was like the Madonna, and you play AC/DC beside Madonna, and then you play, but it was the rock was just so far ahead of the pop in the testing. It was like, let's just get rid of the pop stuff and just go rock. And that's when the station really took off. And since then, I think to this day, it's been the number one 25-54 rock station in Kitchener, has been for forever, and does really, really well adult 25-54.
Tell me about your experience at the Move.
Oh boy. Yeah. So, brief run. It was a tough one because, and to this day, that frequency is cursed and struggles today as Today Radio.
93. It's 93.5.
Yeah.
Which was the original Flow frequency, I believe.
Yeah.
And
I think, and understandably, when they took on Flow, the station was doing okay, but it was in that just below the mid pack, and it's like, how do we get it, from a 4 to a 6 share, or what's going on? And that's where they started experimenting, and they tried this Move thing, which was more throwbacks and classic hip hop, R&B, and they brought me in because that wasn't quite working out the way they expected, and they brought me in. And it was an interesting time. Some great people there, but I did struggle because they were not giving me the freedom and all the control I wanted. And I do like a lot of control. It's like, just let me do my thing, and either the ratings go up and then we're good. If they don't, then fire me, but let me give it a shot. So it was tough because when I went in, I want to change this, and this, and there was like, and I understand that you've already made a few changes, so you don't want to change everything, but it was like, yes, no, and yes and no, 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 no. And so at one point, eventually I was able to make another presentation and get more of the things I think it needed. And I went in with that, and that was only given 13 weeks. And 13 weeks, they pulled the plug on it and went back to flow. And I was frustrated because I wasn't given long enough an opportunity to see my vision come to be. But I understand the pressures. It's Toronto radio, and it's scary. There's a lot of money involved. And I don't think they were wrong. I thought going back to flow wasn't a bad idea. And but then again, and maybe it's because of the flip flop and changes that flow never was able to gain traction and grow. And we talked about this earlier, that how is it that flow wasn't a top 3 station in Toronto? It's bizarre that that never happened.
Yeah. And, the last 4 or 5 ideas that have gone on that frequency, I've said, oh, that's going to work. Including the move. I thought, oh, this is going to be my favorite radio station. Oh, that's going to work. Yeah. And then they changed it. Oh, that'll work. And then the next one, and none of them have worked. And at which point I said, I don't think I can be a program director anymore, because I've totally rubber stamped all these great ideas and nothing moves. But to be fair, all new radio ideas regarding format don't seem to work anymore.
100%.
Okay,
100%.
Why is that?
100%. And I just think, and I think that if you look at, I think any after the year 2000, I think if you're going to start a new station or start a new format, with very few exceptions, it's so difficult, because the internet had taken hold, in streaming. Well, Napster, of course, was here, and the sharing of MP3s, and people were finding other ways to discover music and listen to music, and radio just lost that stranglehold of power. And so, the stations that have done well over the years and to this day were long established, branded for many, many years. And certainly stations like Boom in Toronto, if you're playing a lot of classic hits that people grew up on radio with, is recipe for success. Starting a new format, and the why today radio is not working in Toronto, outside of the fact that format really, I think, when we look at it now, it's only really truly Edmonton that it's worked, right? On the scale, right?
Yeah, and it's number 1 females 25-54 in the latest ratings that I just read earlier today.
Yeah, and so I think that's just a pure anomaly, that it's not a format, it's just a radio station that worked really well in Edmonton. And I think everybody should understand that. And so, but the challenge for today in Toronto, and anybody trying a new format in an established city of radio stations, it's just like you could spend a fortune and not go anywhere. And I think that time is come and gone in the world of radio. So I think you've just got to just take what you have and make it the best. Take your heritage and just build on that. That's the best thing you can do today. It's too splintered. There may be some resurgence someday. Who knows, that the radio could have a new revival like vinyl records did, or something could happen. Nobody knows the future. But I think I would not spend a fortune on marketing to try and launch a new format in radio today. Not a chance.
If I bought a radio station for you tomorrow, what would you do with it?
Well, the fun side of me would go classic alternative. That would be fun.
Yeah.
But again, it's a new station. Even though you're playing, established older music, you still got to try to cut into what is existing in that market. Very difficult, right?
Well, I don't think it's nuts. I mean, I hear New Order all the time on TikTok.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it's is what's out there that nobody's doing that that people know the music. There's enough of the music known to be successful. Yeah, and you could argue that that's part of Boom's success, that they play, a certain percentage, certainly of alternative music, certainly from the 80s, that crossed over and became mainstream, right?
Yeah.
They obviously, Boom plays a lot of really well-tested records, and it's just such a well-programmed radio station, from all the things we've talked about, from the music to the announcers and everything in between. It's just a great radio station.
It's very, very expensive to toss out a brand. And we've talked a few times about, no, we're going to get rid of Flow. We're going to get rid of Power 97. We're going to get rid of Cool FM in Ottawa, like some of the more laughable ones that go on. We're not talking about stations that get purchased. They get rebranded. And it's incredibly expensive to go and to build them back up. So I think that's a great piece of advice not to do it. And you said something, and that's sort of, double down on your heritage. And,
yes.
And
yes.
along comes the CFNY documentary. And, I've heard some radio stations in the last little while. They'll get to 25 years. They'll get to their 30th. They get to their 50th. And they don't do year-long promotions to celebrate this stuff and to really acknowledge their past. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that could be budget, or maybe the people who they don't listen to us anymore. But what an opportunity to talk about the past and talk about where you've come from and where you may be going. So, but here's the CFNY documentary. So,
yes.
What's the genesis of this?
Yeah, and Corus has been really good. Just to talk again about Corus, they've been really, really open and supportive with the whole plans and endorsed the documentary. So that's been great. But sorry, your question just about how did it come about?
Yeah, tell me how it all came together, because these things never seem to happen inside the radio station. They seem to happen from outside forces.
Yeah, that's true. And I think sometimes a business and radio stations get caught so much up into the day to day, and there needs to be somebody that kind of steps back and go, hey, where are we? And whether it's a Tim Hortons celebrating 60 years, it probably took somebody in the marketing department to go, hey, by the way, we're coming up on 60 years. We should do something. And there's probably a whole bunch of people going, I'd never thought of that, until somebody was paying attention. Because, and again, in a lot of in the corporate business world, radio stations these days are owned by media companies or other companies that radio wasn't necessarily their number one business plan. And so it's important to have people involved in the station that can look at those sort of things. And I remember, when I was at CFNY, I was doing some research, and I was there, I don't know, it was like I had started 1984, and it's somewhere in there I was doing some research for Live in Toronto, and I came across, the station actually started in 1977. And it's 1976, and next year we'll be coming up on 10 years. And that's when I went down to a few people at the station in the promo department. We started saying, hey, we should do something for the 10th anniversary of the radio station. And it just grew from there, and it turned into the Canada Day CFNY anniversary special, which really took off and later became Edgefest. So there was just a simple little, hey, it's our anniversary's coming up. But I think it takes somebody to just pay attention to these sort of things that aren't normally thought about, So, Alan Cross really, is the credit for, coming up with, hey, we should do a documentary on the radio station. And I think partly because he had seen, and we had seen, some documentaries from other really influential, important kind of outlier radio stations in the U.S. That had made a mark in the music industry and made a mark in their city for being bold and brave and doing and playing music nobody else was playing, and having an interesting story. And I think once he started looking at it and talking to a few people, we all thought, "Oh my God, it's a great story," especially because it started as this tiny little radio station, literally in a house in Brampton. It wasn't a Toronto station; it was a Brampton radio station. So there's a whole bunch of elements, and I think when I came on board to be part of the executive producer team, we brought in a couple of people that knew how to put a film together, that knew how to do documentaries, because we were just a couple of music geeks that loved radio and certainly worked at the station and knew the station's story, but like, is it interesting enough? But that's one of the things when we talk to the other people, they're like, oh, they love this little house story. There's a tiny little house that was filthy and infested with mice and was barely paying the bills, and so many other little stories that went along with it. And all of a sudden, the station's starting at a time when punk is just happening and new waves happening, and all these really cool new trends in music were happening. So it all kind of blended together to, this is a story that could be told. And so that's where it started, and it just grew from there. And we are, as we speak, just waiting for a debut date. There's just a few things that need to be ironed out. One of the things that takes time in doing a documentary is getting music clearances. That is not only expensive, but time consuming. And so I think we're just a couple more that we're waiting for. And we're waiting for, we've reached out to some of the festivals, some key festivals that do premieres, not the least of which is TIFF. And we're just waiting to hear some answers on getting some premiere dates. And then we can do some probably select theater openings and screenings in certain towns and places. And then eventually, I think the goal is to get it on a streaming service so people can just, in the comfort of their own home, watch the documentary. But we're all super excited about it.
Good. Yeah, no, anytime there's an opportunity to celebrate radio, and I am beginning to see a trend of radio's past being celebrated, and it's great to see these stations here today. Just in the last few weeks, we've talked about Melbourne Radio Wars, which is something that's going on right now. Craig Bruce was on the show; he talked about it as well. Roz and Mocha have a documentary about how they've come together, a docu-series, and that's a podcast. And I started this doing radio stories, but after 8 years, we're still doing it. We're writing another chapter of radio stories every week in this thing, and I'll probably be doing this till I die. I don't think I'll retire.
No, and it is. And, one of the things is, as we were doing it, we knew these things, but when you're talking about it again, you realize how powerful radio was, and for breaking music. Like when you talk about the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and to a degree the 90s, there was no other place to get your music, and it's where everybody went for their music. Very, very powerful, and even a time, not every station, but one of the unique things about CFNY, and as an announcer and DJ on CFNY, it's still bizarre to think that I could actually pick my own records. The hour started and my song's running out, and I can look at a wall of music and I just run over and grab a record. Like, fantastic.
I have 20-year-olds in the house, and I can't believe that they left a major market radio station between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. in the hands of a 20-year-old. When I was 20.
Yep.
What? That's crazy. Yep. I won't even let my kids use the car to go down to the street to get milk.
Yeah, and just, the fact that there were live overnight shows, and very powerful because there were all these shift workers or people that couldn't sleep or people up studying, and there was somebody they could talk to or, call the station, call the announcer, call the DJ. That was pretty cool. A lost art, and who knows, that could come back someday.
I used to listen to CFNY actually just after the mistake of '88, which I hope is documented in the film and you have a chapter on it.
Yes.
Good. So it was 1989, and I was working all nights at a radio station, and you guys were on a satellite dish. And I go, what is Deadly Headley's all-night dance party? Why am I taping this, and why am I going to listen to it on Sunday evening?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Headley and Shep, just huge part of that station, so influential. And, we do talk about that on the doc. And, I forgot about that. I remember that there was, for whatever reason, it was on some satellite feed. And we had other people, in other markets tell us that they would listen, overnights and stuff.
Listen, it sounded great. How long are you going to stay retired, by the way?
Yes. So, retirement. This is a new thing. I'm still finding my groove. But I love it. I just don't want to do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday anymore. But also there were personal reasons from various aging family members that have needed attention and care. Not the least of which was my mother who just passed away just a couple of months ago. But a great life and lived to the age of 87. I've got a stepfather who has very bad progressing dementia that I'm helping with, and so that's a part of reality of life when you're at my age and you've got parents that are in their 80s. So some are healthy, some aren't. So that's been part of it. But also, I just didn't want to do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So, I'm open to doing the little side projects and things here and there. And obviously, this CFNY documentary has been a thrill to be a part of. I knew nothing about filmmaking, so I've learned a lot about that, about doing a documentary and how that's done. And so that's thrilling. And of course, when it comes out, we're hoping to do, as I mentioned, some screenings and have some fun around that, including, maybe some dance parties, maybe bring back the Video Roadshow and do a couple of events. So that would be fun. And, other things that may come up. So open to things. But I think just out of the gate for me is I've got just a whole bunch of other small things. Like I said, some family stuff that I got to look after before I jump too much into any other project at this time.
Scott, thanks so much for doing this. I've been wanting to do this for years. We couldn't do it when we worked together because we actually had to do work. Surprise, surprise. Yes,
indeed. But thank you. Yeah, no, it's been awesome. Thank you. Sorry it took a little while, but been a thrill. Anytime.
The Sound Off Podcast is written and hosted by Matt Kundle. Produced by Evan Serminski. Edited by Chloe Emo Lane. Social media by Aiden Glassy. Another great creation from the Sound Off Media Company. There's always more at soundoffpodcast.com.